It was on the night of the Academy Awards in 1949 that Ingrid Bergman appeared, radiant as ever, the image of grace upon a stage lit by golden light. Yet beneath the shimmer of applause there moved faint murmurs, a whispering tide that hinted of storms to come. A star beloved soon to be condemned, a figure who would pass from adoration into exile and back again. And so I greet you, listener across time and distance. May you share in this telling by leaving word of where and when you listen, so that you join a memory that travels across the world like scattered lanterns in the night. And before we wander further into this long path of story, I invite you to press the subscribe button to keep this circle unbroken, to let these voices of the past continue their quiet passage into the present. She was born in the northern lands, where the air is cool and the light lingers in strange ways, never fully gone in summer, never fully present in winter. Ingrid Bergman came into the world in 1915 in Stockholm, where waters shimmered in the harbor and the great city was still small enough to hear the tolling of church bells across its streets. Hers was not a childhood filled with abundance. Instead, it was one of loss and absence, the kind of absence that shapes a spirit more than presence ever can. Her mother, Friedel Adler, died when Ingrid was still a girl, not yet 3 years old, leaving behind only the faint memory of a voice and the faintest scent of perfume clinging to old belongings. And her father, Justus Bergman, a man of German descent and artistic sensibilities, raised her in solitude until his own death when she was but 13. Imagine a child who carries photographs instead of parents, who learns to hold a camera as if it were a hand, because her father, with his love of images, taught her to pose, to smile, to stand before the lens as though it were both mirror and witness. Ingrid would later say that the camera had known her longer than anyone else. How curious, then, that the camera became her destiny, the device that first recorded her loss and later immortalized her presence. When her father died, the world did not soften its hand. She was sent to live with relatives distant and unfamiliar. Though they gave her a roof, there was no gentle comfort of belonging. The silences of those rooms became her companions, the long winters of Sweden pressing in with their chill. How does a young girl learn to speak when the people around her rarely listen? Perhaps she turns inward. Perhaps she builds a secret fire, unseen, waiting for the chance to burn into the open. And so it was with Ingrid, with tall, awkward, too large for the girlish roles around her. She stood in classrooms like a misplaced figure. Yet in her solitude, she discovered the power of voice and presence. The mirror did not frighten her. The silence did not crush her. She practiced words. She practiced expressions. She let the empty air become her audience. Some lives are prepared by joy, but hers was prepared by sorrow. And in sorrow, she discovered endurance. The early photographs from her youth show a face not yet sculpted into the beauty that later dazzled the world. Her hair was unruly, her brows strong, her figure awkward. But there was something else in her gaze, a mixture of longing and directness, as if she were always searching beyond the moment, beyond the camera, beyond the present itself. One wonders if she already knew, somewhere deep in her marrow, that she was not meant to remain among the quiet houses of Stockholm, that the stage awaited her, though she could not yet name it. At 13, she was already motherless, fatherless, cast among relatives who could not offer her the world of tenderness she needed. Yet perhaps it was precisely this that hardened her spirit and made her hunger for expression. What does one do with grief at that age? Some hide it, some break beneath it, but she turned it into a silence that waited, a silence that could one day become speech. It was at school that her unusual height made her stand apart, but it was also at school that she discovered performance. The teachers saw in her something striking, not the pretty charm of a child star, but the commanding presence of a figure larger than herself. They urged her toward drama, toward the theater, toward the Royal Dramatic Theatre School in Stockholm. Here at last was a place where silence became words, where absence was given form, where a girl could become many women and yet remain herself. She entered those halls with a mixture of fear and resolve. The smell of dust from the wooden stage, the faint murmur of other students rehearsing lines in corners, the rustle of old curtains, all of it felt both alien and familiar. For the first time, she was surrounded by others who, too, longed to become someone else, or perhaps to find themselves by wearing masks. The craft of acting was not simply performance, it was a search for the lost parts of the self. And Ingrid had many lost parts to recover. In those first days of study, she was not yet radiant. She stumbled, she hesitated, she often seemed too restrained. But gradually something began to emerge, not a false brightness, but a deep authenticity. She did not act to pretend, she acted to reveal. Teachers noticed this difference. While others imitated, she embodied. While others performed for applause, she seemed to speak to the hidden ear of silence itself. What is beauty, then? Was it her features which the camera later adored? Or was it something else? An intensity that made her seem truthful even when she was telling a story not her own. Perhaps beauty is less about form than about honesty, and Ingrid, having lost so much so young, had no patience for lies. She carried her grief with her, even on stage, and it gave her weight. And so the young orphan of Stockholm began her path. A girl formed by absence, a girl watched by cameras since childhood, a girl who would one day stir the hearts of millions. Yet in those days she was still just a student, learning lines in the dim light of a rehearsal room, her voice unsteady, her presence still forming. But within her was already the seed of what was to come, a restlessness, an openness to destiny. The same force that later made her reach out to a director across the sea, the same force that made her defy a nation's condemnation, the same force that drew her always toward love and art no matter the cost. It was already there, in the silence of her youth, in the loneliness of her nights, in the still photographs left by her father. The image lingers now, a young girl standing in a dim Swedish room, the air thick with quiet, a photograph of her lost parents on the table, and a mirror before her. She looks into it, rehearsing words to no one. The mirror does not reply, but it remembers. And perhaps that mirror is still speaking, even now. The mirror does not reply, but it remembers. And in the dim glow of her adolescence, it became her most faithful audience. Ingrid Bergman stood before that polished surface, not to admire herself, but to practice, to test, to search. Words whispered into the quiet would return to her ears in strange echoes, and gestures rehearsed before the glass seemed to take on a life of their own. She was not yet the luminous presence that the world would later know, but already she was shaping herself, line by line, glance by glance, as if sculpting a statue out of air. It was here, in these private rehearsals, that her path toward the theater became clear. Encouraged by her teachers, she applied to the Royal Dramatic Theatre School in Stockholm, the most prestigious of its kind in her country. The application was daunting, the competition fierce, and yet when she stepped into the audition room, she carried with her the weight of her solitude, a gravity that distinguished her from others. She did not dazzle with polished technique, but there was something undeniable in her presence, a quality that teachers would later describe as raw, unvarnished truth. And so, in 1933, at the age of 18, she was accepted. The school itself seemed a world apart, a place of tradition and reverence where young aspirants bent their voices to Shakespeare, Ibsen, Strindberg, and Molière. The walls smelled of old wood and chalk, of fabric costumes stored for decades, of candle wax melted long ago when theaters still relied on flames instead of lamps. Ingrid entered this world with both excitement and timidity, her tall figure making her stand out, her uncertain voice carrying the tremor of someone who had not yet found her ground. And yet, even in her hesitations, there was a sincerity that disarmed her instructors. Among her fellow students, she was not the most popular, for she was quiet, somewhat withdrawn, preferring long walks along Stockholm's waterfront to loud gatherings. She did not hunger for attention in the way others did. Instead, she studied the details of life, the gestures of strangers at a cafe, the sound of footsteps on cobblestones, the way a bird tilted its head before flight. Acting, she believed, was not an act of invention but of observation, and she absorbed everything around her as material. Perhaps it was this habit of watchfulness, cultivated in lonely childhood, that gave her performances a rare depth. Her first roles at the school were modest. She played maids, background figures, characters whose presence seemed secondary to the central drama. But even in these fleeting appearances, she carried herself with a dignity that refused to vanish. Teachers noticed how she never treated a role as small. Even a line spoken in passing seemed, in her mouth, to carry weight, as though the world paused for that moment. They began to encourage her, offering larger parts, and slowly she began to step into the light. Yet, the theater was not only a place of practice, it was also a place of doubt. Ingrid was plagued by insecurities about her appearance. She was tall, nearly 5'10", with broad features that did not conform to the delicate standard of beauty in Swedish cinema of the time. She often felt too awkward, too plain, convinced that her dream of a career might collapse under the simple reality of her body. These doubts were whispered to her by classmates and critics alike. And yet, when the curtain rose, her face seemed to transform, her presence to expand, until those same features that caused her unease became the very reason she was unforgettable. It was during this period that she began to appear in small film roles. Swedish cinema, though modest in scale compared to Hollywood, was thriving in the 1930s, and directors were always seeking new talent. Ingrid, with her unusual look and her naturalism, soon caught their attention. Her first significant part came in the 1935 film Munkbrogräven, a romantic drama that showcased her in a secondary role. She did not carry the story, but audiences noticed her. There was something about her gaze, her unstudied movements that felt different from the polished gestures of her contemporaries. Still, she hesitated to leave the stage behind. The theater, with its live breath of audience and performer, seemed purer to her. The cinema felt mechanical, dependent on lights, lenses, and spliced strips of film. Yet the camera loved her in a way no mirror could, capturing not only her face, but the invisible current of emotions beneath her skin. Her directors told her so. She resisted at first, but the lure of cinema grew stronger. One cannot help but wonder, did she feel a kind of destiny unfolding, as though the absence of her parents had prepared her for this constant act of performance? Did the camera, replacing her father's lens, become her way of continuing a conversation with the dead? No one can say for certain, but it is striking that her earliest and most tender memories were of being photographed, posed and watched, framed and recorded. The child who had stood before her father's lens now stood before the lens of an industry, and both captured her with the same mixture of intimacy and distance. By the late 1930s, she had become one of Sweden's promising young stars. Films such as Intermezzo in 1936 brought her greater recognition, allowing her to embody the role of a pianist's lover with striking realism. She did not rely on theatrical exaggeration, but conveyed emotion through subtle gestures. The lowering of her eyes, the trembling of her hand, the quiet pauses between words. This understated quality set her apart, and Swedish critics praised her for bringing a new kind of honesty to the screen. Her success in Intermezzo proved pivotal, for it was this film that later caught the attention of Hollywood. But at the time, Ingrid could not have known the path it would open. For now, she was still a young woman in Stockholm, walking through its narrow streets, hearing the call of bells over the city, rehearsing lines in quiet rooms. She lived modestly, with little luxury, her career still uncertain, and yet within her was already the seed of that luminous figure who would one day stand before the world. There is a photograph from this era. Ingrid dressed simply, hair unstyled, her expression earnest and unguarded. She looks not at the camera, but beyond it, as though waiting for something unseen. It is in this gaze that one glimpses the transition she was about to undergo, from student to star, from local actress to international figure. And so the mirror that once reflected only a lonely girl in Stockholm now reflected a woman stepping into her craft. But the mirror was not done with her, nor was the camera. They would continue to follow her, to shape her, to hold her secrets. As she left the rehearsal rooms of the Royal Dramatic Theatre to walk into her first film sets, the air around her seemed to hum with possibility. The smell of dust from the stage gave way to the chemical tang of film lights, the stillness of theater audiences replaced by the silence of cameras rolling. And yet, in both places, she carried the same quiet intensity. The image remains. Ingrid Bergman walking alone through Stockholm streets after a day of filming, the lamplight glinting off wet cobblestones, her tall figure cloaked in shadow. She moves not hurriedly but deliberately, as though she senses that her journey has only begun, that greater storms and greater lights lie ahead. And in that lamplight, one wonders, did she already sense that her destiny would carry her far beyond Sweden, across oceans, into the heart of Hollywood itself? She moves through the lamplight of Stockholm, her footsteps echoing softly on wet cobblestones. And though the city is quiet, the world beyond its borders has already begun to turn its gaze toward her. The film Intermezzo of 1936 had been only a modest production in Sweden, but it carried within it a tenderness and truth that crossed oceans. In darkened rooms in America, far from the streets of her homeland, a few discerning eyes caught sight of this young actress whose presence seemed at once unadorned and luminous. There was talk, quiet at first, that perhaps this Swedish woman could bring something new to Hollywood, something unmanufactured, something real. But before Hollywood could summon her, Ingrid Bergman continued her work in Sweden, shaping her craft. She acted in films that varied in scope, some quickly forgotten, others lingering in the public's imagination. What set her apart was never glamour alone, though beauty she had. It was the peculiar way in which she inhabited each character as if they were not inventions, but neighbors, friends, or fragments of herself. The camera did not catch her pretending, it caught her being, and that was rare. In an age when many stars relied on exaggerated gesture, she relied on the smallest inflections, a hesitant smile, a quiet glance, the tremor of withheld emotion. Sweden in those years was still marked by restraint, by modesty, by a sense of quiet distance from the storms gathering in Europe. Ingrid herself embodied some of that restraint, yet also something else, something restless. She had been raised in loss, grown in silence, and it seemed she could not fully belong to any single place. As her reputation grew, she began to feel the tug of a world beyond. Was it ambition that stirred her, or longing? Perhaps the two were not separate. Perhaps for her, ambition was another name for longing, the yearning to find a home in art when the world of family and belonging had failed her. It was David O. Selznick, the powerful Hollywood producer, who saw her performance in Intermezzo and sensed its potential. He invited her to America to remake the film in English, believing her natural style would captivate audiences weary of artifice. And so, in 1939, Ingrid set sail across the Atlantic. One can imagine her on the deck of that ship, the cold wind of the ocean in her hair, gazing at the horizon with both anticipation and trepidation. She was 24 years old, tall and striking, yet still carrying the uncertainties of one who had never thought of herself as beautiful in the conventional sense. What awaited her was a world unlike anything she had known. Hollywood in those years was both dazzling and devouring. Its studios glittered with lights, its boulevards were alive with the hum of cars, and its billboards carried faces that seemed larger than life. Ingrid entered this world with an innocence that startled those around her. She refused to pluck her thick eyebrows. She resisted the heavy makeup demanded of most actresses, and she kept her natural height, refusing to stoop or conceal it. She seemed almost careless about her appearance, yet in this carelessness lay her power. Audiences who saw her on screen felt that she was not manufactured for them, but revealed to them, as if they were glimpsing an unguarded soul. The remake of Intermezzo was her American debut, and though the film itself was modest, her presence was unforgettable. Critics praised her freshness, her lack of artifice, her ability to convey deep feeling with little more than a glance. Audiences embraced her. Here was a woman unlike the polished starlets they had grown accustomed to. She was elegant yet approachable, beautiful yet natural, carrying within her an authenticity that felt like a balm in a world already inching toward war. The timing of her arrival was uncanny. The late 1930s and early 1940s were years of upheaval, as Europe descended into conflict and America watched with wary eyes. In this climate, Ingrid Bergman came to embody something more than an actress. She became a symbol of purity, of goodness, of the kind of moral clarity that people longed for in uncertain times. Her roles often reflected this. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1941, she played a woman torn between vulnerability and virtue. In Casablanca, 1942, she became Ilse Lund, the woman who must choose between personal love and greater duty. Each role seemed to echo her own inner divisions, her struggle between desire and principle. Yet even as Hollywood embraced her, Ingrid remained somewhat apart. She never fully immersed herself in the glamour of the industry, preferring books and quiet evenings to parties. She was married already to Dr. Petter Lindström, a Swedish physician, and together they had a daughter, Pia. For a time, she attempted to balance the domestic with the professional, but the balance was uneasy. Hollywood demanded devotion, and so did her home life. The tension between the two would shadow her for years to come. What is striking in these early Hollywood years is how quickly she became both adored and enshrined. Her image was not merely that of an actress, but of a moral figure, a woman who seemed to stand above scandal or compromise. Magazines praised her wholesomeness, her honesty, her refusal to bend to artificial standards of beauty. To a conservative America, she became a kind of saintly figure, a model of virtue in a world clouded by uncertainty. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, did this very image become a kind of prison for her? Was she truly as serene as they believed? Or did the silence of her childhood still whisper within her, urging her toward choices that would one day shatter this illusion? Her films during this period deepened her reputation. Casablanca, of course, immortalized her. The image of Ingrid Bergman standing in the mist of the airport, her face luminous with conflict and sorrow, became one of the defining moments of cinema. Audiences wept not only for the story, but for the truth they sensed behind it. She seemed genuinely torn, genuinely wounded, as if the script had touched upon her own life. And perhaps it had, for already within her was a restlessness, a yearning for something beyond the safe boundaries of marriage and reputation. Other films followed. Gaslight, 1944, where she played a woman manipulated into madness. Notorious, 1946, where her collaboration with Alfred Hitchcock revealed a deeper sensuality, a darker side of her screen presence. Each role seemed to peel back another layer, as though the camera was slowly uncovering the complexities beneath her luminous exterior. She was no longer simply a symbol of purity, but a woman of contradictions, capable of desire, vulnerability, and defiance. As the 1940s came to a close, Ingrid Bergman was one of the most celebrated actresses in the world. She had won an Academy Award for Gaslight. She was admired by audiences and critics alike, and she seemed untouchable. Yet beneath this success, the restlessness continued. She longed for greater artistic freedom, for roles that would challenge her beyond the formulas of Hollywood melodrama. And in this longing lay the seeds of her next great chapter, one that would carry her far from Hollywood's embrace and into scandal, exile, and transformation. The image lingers now. Ingrid walking through the boulevards of Los Angeles at night, the neon lights reflecting in her eyes, the ocean air carrying faintly inland. She is adored, praised, enshrined, yet within her there stirs a hunger that no applause can satisfy. It is a hunger that will soon lead her to write a letter, simple and bold, that will alter the course of her life forever. And so the lamplight of Stockholm becomes the neon light of Hollywood. But in both, she walks alone, tall and searching, the silence of her childhood still trailing behind her like a shadow. The neon light of Hollywood shimmered in her eyes, yet it did not warm her. Ingrid Bergman, though cherished as one of the brightest stars of the 1940s, found herself restless in this city that manufactured dreams with the precision of factories. Her performances had brought her acclaim, her face adorned magazine covers across continents, and yet a quiet dissatisfaction pressed upon her spirit. Applause can echo only so long before it fades into silence, and silence was something she knew too well. Beneath the brilliance of her success, there stirred an unease, a sense that she was repeating patterns rather than exploring unknown depths. It was in these years that the idea of art, not as entertainment but as truth, began to call to her with greater urgency. Hollywood offered glamour, but its stories were often polished, predictable, safe. Ingrid longed for something rawer, something that would strip away the artifice and expose the marrow of life. This longing found a direction when she encountered the films of Roberto Rossellini, the Italian director whose neo-realist works had startled the world in the aftermath of war, his Rome. Open City was not a tale of stars in gowns or heroes on stages, but of ordinary people, filmed amid the rubble of a broken city, their lives filled with hunger, fear, and resilience. To Ingrid, watching from the comfort of Hollywood, these films were like a revelation. They reminded her of the Sweden of her youth, of the plainness, the honesty, the unadorned beauty of reality. They spoke to her as no script had spoken in years. And so, in a moment both impulsive and fateful, she sat down to write a letter. It was not a grand declaration, but its simplicity carried a boldness that astonishes even now. I saw your films and enjoyed them very much. If you need a Swedish actress who speaks English very well, who has not forgotten her German, who is not very understandable in French, and who can only say ti amo in Italian, I am ready to come and make a film with you. This letter, written with a mixture of humility and daring, was sent across the ocean to Rossellini in Rome. Did she imagine he would answer? Did she sense, as the ink dried, that her life was shifting course? One cannot know. What is certain is that Rossellini did respond, and the response was not simply professional. He invited her to collaborate, yes, but from the moment they met, there was an intensity, a recognition, that transcended the ordinary boundaries of director and actress. By this time, Ingrid was married to Dr. Petter Lindstrom and was a mother to their daughter Pia. Her marriage, though outwardly stable, had long been shadowed by discontent. She admired her husband's intellect, respected his devotion to his work, but she also felt constrained by the domestic life it demanded. In Rossellini, she found not only a collaborator, but a mirror of her own hunger for authenticity, for passion, for freedom. Their connection was swift, undeniable, and dangerous. When Ingrid traveled to Italy to begin filming Stromboli, the world assumed it was a professional venture, a celebrated actress lending her fame to a European director's vision. Yet behind the scenes, another story was unfolding. The volcanic island where they filmed, barren and windswept, became the stage not only for the film's narrative, but for their love affair. The smoke of the volcano, the crash of the waves, the cries of seabirds. These became witnesses to a union that would soon ignite a scandal of unprecedented scale. Word spread quickly. Hollywood, and indeed America itself, reacted with shock and fury when it became known that Ingrid was carrying Rossellini's child while still married to her husband. The saintly figure they had exalted, the woman of purity and moral clarity, had defied their expectations. Senators spoke of her on the floor of Congress, condemning her as immoral, a threat to the public good. Letters poured in denouncing her. Newspapers branded her a fallen idol. In an era when the private lives of stars were expected to remain hidden behind carefully constructed images, Ingrid's choice to follow her passion openly was seen as a betrayal. But before the storm erupted fully, there was still the quiet moment of beginning, the act of writing that letter, the decision to board a ship, the first meeting with Rossellini. These small acts carried within them the seeds of everything that followed. One can picture her in the quiet of her home, pen in hand, her daughter sleeping nearby, her husband occupied with his work. She writes the words quickly, perhaps not fully realizing the weight they carry, and folds the letter into an envelope. Outside, Hollywood's streets glow with artificial light, but inside, she has lit a different flame, one that will burn through her life. What draws a person to such a risk? Was it the artist in her, restless and unsatisfied with the roles she had been given? Was it the woman in her, weary of restraint, yearning for passion? Or was it both, entwined so tightly that they could not be separated? Perhaps she herself did not know. Perhaps she only felt the inexorable pull toward a man and a vision that promised a deeper truth. And so the neon light of Hollywood fades into the fiery glow of Stromboli's volcano, the transition not only of geography, but of destiny. Ingrid Bergman, once enshrined as Hollywood's saint, had begun her descent into scandal. Yet for her, it may not have felt like a descent at all, but an ascent into a form of life more honest, more dangerous, and more her own. The image lingers. The letter, lying on a desk in Rome, Rossellini opening it, reading the words aloud and smiling faintly. Outside his window, the war-torn city rebuilds itself brick by brick, its streets alive with resilience. He folds the letter carefully, already sensing, perhaps, that fate has sent him not only an actress, but a partner who will change both his art and his life. And so, as Ingrid walks the boulevards of Los Angeles under neon lights, across the ocean, another man now carries her words in his pocket. Words that will soon draw her into his orbit. Words that will ignite not only a love affair, but a scandal that will shake the very foundations of her career. The fiery glow of Stromboli's volcano, its smoke curling into the Italian sky, became the first witness to Ingrid Bergman's leap into a new life. Yet before she had ever set foot on that island, before the scandal that erupted from her choices, she had already been etched into the memory of the world by another role, one film not amid volcanic ash, but in the controlled shadows of a Hollywood studio. Casablanca, released in 1942, carried her into the realm of legend. The story was simple on its surface. A woman torn between two loves, one personal, one political. But within its lines lay the tensions that had always shaped Ingrid's life. As Ilsa Lund, she embodied longing itself, her face illuminated by the soft glow of black and white film, her voice carrying the ache of impossible choice. Audiences saw not only a character, but a reflection of themselves, caught between desire and duty, between the private heart and the public world. When she stood opposite Humphrey Bogart, her gaze filled with sorrow and devotion, she seemed to carry centuries of human conflict in her eyes. The mist of the airport farewell, the plane waiting in the background, the music swelling. It was all orchestrated cinema, and yet her presence gave it truth. One wonders if she felt in that performance the stirrings of her own destiny, if the act of playing a woman who chooses duty over passion foreshadowed the opposite choice she herself would soon make. For when life demanded of her such decisions, Ingrid would not take the safer path. The success of Casablanca was immense, its lines repeated by millions, its images seared into collective memory. Ingrid became not just a star, but a symbol. She was the woman who carried both love and sacrifice in her gaze, the woman whose beauty did not seem shallow but profound, infused with melancholy and dignity. And Hollywood, ever eager to capture and replicate, sought to bind her to that image. More films followed in quick succession. Gaslight in 1944 revealed her capacity for fragility, portraying a woman slowly convinced of her own madness. The performance was so convincing that the very word gaslighting entered the language, a testament to the lingering power of her portrayal. For this role, she received her first Academy Award, recognition that her art had transcended entertainment to become something enduring. With Alfred Hitchcock, she explored other shadows. In Spellbound and Notorious, she ventured into realms of desire, fear, and danger, guided by a director who understood how to unearth the hidden layers of his actors. In Notorious, her chemistry with Cary Grant smoldered, but more than romance, the film revealed her ability to convey vulnerability and strength at once. She was no longer merely the saintly figure of Casablanca, but a woman of contradictions, her roles peeling away illusions to reveal complexity. Yet even as her career ascended, Ingrid was restless. Hollywood, with its carefully managed images and rigid expectations, began to feel suffocating. The roles, though varied, were bounded by formulas. She was praised for her purity, for her goodness, for her ability to embody dignity. But inside she longed for something rawer, freer, closer to the rough edges of life she had glimpsed in Rossellini's films. Her marriage, too, was marked by this restlessness. Dr. Petter Lindstrom, her husband, provided stability and respectability, but their lives ran on parallel tracks. He was consumed by his work, she by hers, and the bridge between them grew weaker with time. Their daughter Pia was a bond, but not enough to reconcile the differences of spirit and desire. In public, they remained a family. In private, Ingrid felt the hollowness of compromise. Hollywood adored her, but perhaps it adored a version of her that was never entirely real. She was placed upon a pedestal, her image polished into sainthood, her choices scrutinized for moral purity. The irony, of course, was that beneath this imposed perfection lived a woman of deep passions, of fierce independence, of an unwillingness to live by others' definitions. The very qualities that had made her luminous on screen, the honesty, the refusal to disguise herself, were the same qualities that would not allow her to remain confined in Hollywood's golden cage, and so the foreshadowing was clear. In Casablanca, she played a woman who left her lover to serve a greater cause, and the world praised her. In her own life, when the time came, she would leave respectability to serve her own hunger for art and love, and the world would condemn her. The image lingers. Ingrid in the midst of the airport scene, her eyes glistening, her lips parted as though to speak a truth she cannot utter. The camera captures her indecision, her sorrow, her strength, and somewhere, beyond the boundaries of that studio, beyond the script and the lights, destiny waits with another script not yet written, one that will not end with applause, but with scandal. Thus, the fiery glow of Stromboli's volcano and the mist of Casablanca's airport converge, two landscapes joined by one woman's gaze. One belonged to fiction, carefully lit and orchestrated. The other belonged to life, raw and unpredictable. But in both, Ingrid Bergman walked forward, her tall figure unafraid of shadows, her heart unwilling to settle for half measures. And so the mist of Casablanca drifts into the volcanic smoke of Stromboli, carrying her from the saintly embrace of Hollywood into the dangerous embrace of Italy, where passion and scandal await her. The volcanic smoke of Stromboli lingered in the air, curling in slow shapes against the restless Italian sky, and as Ingrid Bergman stood upon that island, the outlines of her life were being rewritten. What had been fiction in Casablanca now dissolved into reality. And unlike the carefully scripted ending of a film, this story carried no guarantee of applause. She had followed Rossellini into his world of neo-realism, a world where the camera sought truth amid ruins, where stories were not polished into perfection but born from the grit of survival. And in following him, she stepped willingly into scandal. On the barren landscape of Stromboli, she played a woman stranded on a volcanic island, desperate, disoriented, aching for escape. The role mirrored her own state of being, torn between two lives, one already dissolving, the other still forming. The camera captured her amid wind and ash, her tall figure against the harsh terrain, her face lit not by artificial lights, but by the sun itself. There was no glamour here, no carefully brushed perfection, only raw exposure. It was both a liberation and a danger, for the camera that once adored her now revealed her most unguarded truth. As she filmed, whispers spread. News reached America that Ingrid, still married, was carrying Rossellini's child. What had begun as a collaboration became known as an affair, and what might once have been hidden in discreet silence erupted into public outrage. Hollywood, which had crowned her its saint, now branded her its fallen idol. Senators rose on the floor of Congress to condemn her, declaring her unfit to represent the values of America. Newspapers filled their columns with words of betrayal, letters poured in, filled with anger, disappointment, even hatred. How swiftly the world can turn. One moment she was Ilse Lund, beloved by millions, the embodiment of purity and dignity. The next, she was cast as a pariah, accused of selfishness, immorality, even treachery. Audiences who had once wept at her on-screen sacrifices now accused her of abandoning not only her husband, but her daughter. For in America of the late 1940s, to step outside the sanctity of marriage was not merely personal, but political. Ingrid's choices struck at the heart of a nation's sense of morality. And yet, in Italy, amid the volcanic ash and the chaos of filming, she lived a different truth. With Rossellini, she found not respectability but passion, not stability but freedom. Their love was stormy, imperfect, but it carried the intensity of two restless souls who had found in each other a mirror of their hunger. Together, they made not only Stromboli, but also a series of films that sought to blend fiction with life, to reveal the struggles of ordinary existence. These films were often criticized, sometimes misunderstood, but for Ingrid, they represented a break from the polished illusions of Hollywood. Her daughter Pia, left behind with her father, grew up far from this world of passion and scandal. For Ingrid, the separation was painful, yet she seemed to accept it as the price of her choice. Was it selfishness? Was it courage? The question lingers, unresolved, like the smoke over Stromboli's peak. To some, she had betrayed her role as mother and wife. To others, she had chosen authenticity, refusing to live a life that felt false. Perhaps the truth lies in both, for human lives rarely fit into tidy judgments. The condemnation in America grew severe. For nearly a decade, Ingrid Bergman was unwelcome in the country that had once adored her. The halls of Hollywood closed their doors. Producers who had once courted her now looked away, and the public image she had so carefully carried was shattered. She was, in every sense, an exile. But exile is not only punishment. it is also a space of transformation. In Italy, she bore 3 children with Rossellini, twins Isabella and Isotta, and a son, Roberto. And amid the chaos of motherhood and art, she experienced life with a fullness that Hollywood had never granted her. The marriage itself was fraught with tension, storms of jealousy and misunderstanding, but it was also a crucible that reshaped her. She was no longer the saintly star of American screens, but a woman of contradictions, living openly in the fire of her own choices. How strange that the camera, which had once elevated her into an icon, now recorded her downfall. Yet perhaps she welcomed it. Perhaps in a way she preferred the harsh truth of scandal to the suffocating perfection of an image that was never entirely hers. The silence of her childhood had taught her endurance, and in exile she drew upon that endurance once again. And so the volcanic smoke of Stromboli drifts outward, carrying with it the cries of condemnation from afar. In America, her name was spoken with contempt, her films boycotted, her presence erased from the screens she had once graced. In Italy, she walked barefoot upon volcanic ash, holding her children, working with Rossellini, living a life both fuller and more fractured. The image lingers. Ingrid standing on the edge of Stromboli, the sea below her restless, the volcano behind her smoldering, her face caught between light and shadow. The world calls her sinner, exile, fallen star. But in her eyes there is no regret, only the steady fire of a woman who has chosen, however painfully, to live by her own truth. And from that volcanic smoke arises the question, can a woman who has defied a world ever return to its embrace, or does exile mark her forever? The answer would come, but only after years of silence, years of waiting, years of distance. For now, she stood in the ash, her figure illuminated not by applause, but by the raw light of the sun, a star who had defied scandal and been consumed by it, yet who refused to bow beneath its weight. She stood on the edge of Stromboli, the sea restless below and the volcano smoldering behind, her figure marked by scandal in one land and passion in another. And yet within her eyes there burned a light that no condemnation could extinguish. It was this same light that Alfred Hitchcock had once seen and sought to capture, long before her exile in Italy, when Hollywood still claimed her as its own. With Hitchcock, Ingrid Bergman entered into another form of collaboration, not as lovers, but as artists, each testing the depths of the other, each shaping shadows into meaning. When she first worked with him in Spellbound in 1945, she found herself drawn into the world of psychoanalysis, a tale of dreams and deception where the mind itself became the stage. Hitchcock, with his careful eye, recognized in Ingrid a quality that was rare among stars, the ability to embody vulnerability without weakness, to carry desire without artifice. He guided her with precision, sometimes with demands that seemed severe, yet she responded with trust. The result was a performance that balanced intellect and emotion, a portrait of a woman unraveling the mysteries of another while discovering her own. It was in Notorious the following year, however, that their collaboration reached its height. Here Ingrid played Alicia Huberman, the daughter of a Nazi spy, recruited by the government to infiltrate a dangerous circle. The role demanded duplicity, courage, and a profound sensuality. Paired with Cary Grant, she entered into one of the most charged partnerships in cinema. The long, lingering kiss they shared, carefully staged to bypass censorship rules, conveyed more intimacy than countless declarations. Yet what made the role unforgettable was not the romance alone, but the quiet suffering beneath it. Alicia was a woman torn by love, loyalty, and betrayal, and Ingrid gave her a depth that made the story ache with realism. Hitchcock once said that actors were cattle, to be directed and placed as needed. But with Ingrid, he seemed to find something more. He trusted her instincts, gave her room to shape the soul of her characters, and in return she gave him performances that still flicker with life decades later. For her, these films were more than roles. They were explorations of the hidden parts of herself, the shadows she rarely allowed others to see. And yet, even in these triumphs, restlessness stirred. Hollywood, though generous with its praise, was narrow in its imagination. It saw in Ingrid the saint, the symbol, the beacon of purity, and even when her roles delved into darkness, the public still clung to her as an emblem of moral certainty. The irony is striking. It was precisely at the height of these roles, when audiences adored her for embodying self-sacrifice and virtue, that she felt the call of Rossellini and wrote the letter that would alter everything. The very woman who had once knelt before Cary Grant in Notorious, willing to endure danger for love, was preparing in her own life to endure condemnation for passion. Looking back, one might see the collaboration with Hitchcock as a prelude to her leap into Italy. He had drawn from her a sensuality, a rawness, a confrontation with desire that Hollywood itself was not fully prepared to accept. She had tasted on screen the complexity of a woman living at the edge of love and betrayal, and perhaps this awakened something she could no longer keep confined to fiction. When she later stood on Stromboli, it was as if the screen had dissolved and she herself had stepped into the role. Still, the films remain, luminous and enduring. In Notorious, she walks into a room filled with danger, her eyes both wary and determined. In Spellbound, she deciphers the dreams of another while hiding her own. In Under Capricorn, made later in 1949, she portrayed a woman imprisoned by guilt and circumstance, a performance overlooked in its time, yet resonant with echoes of her own life. Each role, in its own way, peeled back another layer of the woman who could never be confined to a single image. But as the volcanic smoke of Stromboli rose and the condemnations in America grew louder, these earlier triumphs took on a different light. The same critics who once praised her now turned her performances into evidence of duplicity, as if the complexity she had brought to her characters had been proof of a hidden immorality. It was easier, perhaps, for the public to condemn her than to accept that the woman they had exalted was, after all, human, capable of longing, of mistakes, of defiance. What is the role of an artist, then? To reflect the ideals of the world, or to challenge them? Ingrid's choices suggest the latter. She had embodied purity on screen, but in life she refused to be bound by it. She had revealed passion in her roles, and in life she lived it, regardless of the cost. Perhaps this is why her work with Hitchcock remains so haunting. It captures the precise moment when the image of saintliness began to fracture, revealing the deeper, darker, truer self beneath. The image lingers. Ingrid in Notorious, weakened by poison, her body fragile, her eyes filled with both fear and love as Cary Grant carries her down a staircase. The scene is tense, thrilling, unforgettable. Yet what makes it powerful is her truth, the vulnerability of a woman who knows she has risked everything. It is not only Alicia Huberman we see, but Ingrid herself, already standing on the edge of risk, already willing to leap. And so the smoke of Stromboli blends with the shadows of Hitchcock's films, both landscapes of danger, both revealing a woman who would not be content with safety. In Hollywood, she walked through rooms of intrigue. In Italy, she walked through volcanic ash. In both, she carried the same light, steady and unbroken, even as the world called her fallen. The question remains unresolved, hanging like the smoke in the air. Did Hitchcock's films awaken in her the courage to defy her own image, or did they simply reveal what was already waiting within her? The question lingers like smoke. Did Hitchcock awaken in her the courage to defy her own image, or did he merely reveal what had always been hidden inside her, waiting for its hour? From this unresolved mystery, we return again to the simple act that changed everything, the writing of a letter. It is often not the grand gestures that alter the course of a life, but the quiet moments when a hand moves across paper, when ink dries into words that cannot be recalled. Ingrid Bergman, still adorned with Hollywood's crown, still beloved as the woman of Casablanca and Notorious, sat one evening and composed a note to Roberto Rossellini. She had seen his films, the harsh yet tender portraits of post-war Italy, where actors and non-actors mingled in streets filled with rubble, where truth was not disguised by glamour. His Rome, open city, had pierced her heart, not only with its story, but with its honesty. This was the art she longed for, stripped bare, without polish, without the burden of image. And so she wrote with a mixture of humility and daring, offering herself to his vision. The letter was brief, almost playful in its tone, yet it carried within it the full weight of her restlessness. If you need a Swedish actress who speaks English very well, who has not forgotten her German, who's not very understandable in French, and who can only say ti amo in Italian, I am ready to come and make a film with you. Such words, light on the surface, were heavy beneath. They were the words of a woman prepared to step beyond safety, to leave behind the secure walls of Hollywood and her life in America, to walk toward a stranger whose work had awakened something long dormant in her. Rossellini, upon receiving the letter, read it with delight. To him, it was not only the arrival of an actress of great renown, but of a spirit attuned to the honesty he sought. For his films were not meant to dazzle, but to reveal, and in Ingrid he sensed a rare willingness to shed the trappings of stardom and enter into raw experience. He invited her to collaborate on a new project, a film set on the volcanic island of Stromboli, a place as stark and unyielding as the truths he wished to capture. When Ingrid arrived in Italy, the air itself seemed different. Gone were the manicured boulevards of Hollywood, the sound of cameras humming in perfect studios, the polish of lights and costumes. Here the streets were narrow, the stones worn from centuries, the people hardened by survival. She was not treated as a goddess, but as a woman, and though this was unsettling, it was also liberating. She shed her gowns, her carefully arranged image, and stood in simple clothes among fishermen and villagers, her tall figure conspicuous yet strangely at home. The meeting with Rossellini was electric, not in the sense of instant romance, but of recognition. Here were two restless spirits, both seeking truth in a world too fond of illusion. He spoke of cinema not as entertainment, but as revelation, not as glamour, but as witness. She listened, drawn not only by his ideas, but by the fervor with which he spoke them. Soon their collaboration deepened into intimacy, and intimacy into passion. The barren island of Stromboli became not only the setting of their film, but of their love. News of this union, however, did not remain confined to the island. Word spread quickly, and when it reached America, the reaction was volcanic in its own way. Hollywood, which had exalted her as a paragon of virtue, recoiled. Senators denounced her, newspapers branded her immoral. Audiences who had once adored her turned their faces away. To love, to follow her own hunger, to seek artistic freedom, these were sins that America of the late 1940s was unwilling to forgive. And yet, one must pause to consider the courage of that letter. For in it, Ingrid had written not only to Rossellini, but to fate itself, inviting transformation, even destruction. It was not a calculated decision, but a leap into the unknown, the act of a woman unwilling to live only in the roles others had chosen for her. What is art if it does not risk scandal? What is love if it does not risk loss? As filming began on Stromboli, the volcanic landscape seemed to mirror her own upheaval. She wandered its desolate slopes in character, but also in truth, a woman trapped between confinement and longing, seeking escape, seeking renewal. The camera captured her against smoke and sea, her face bare of adornment, her voice carrying the tremor of reality. It was as though she had stepped out of Hollywood's dream and into the harsh clarity of life itself. Her marriage in America faltered beyond repair. Her daughter Pia remained with her father, and this loss carved deeply into Ingrid's heart, though she rarely spoke of it. With Rossellini, she would have 3 more children, but the wound of separation never healed. Perhaps this was the price of that letter, of that choice, of that leap into passion. Was it worth it? Did she believe it so? She never offered the world a simple answer, and perhaps that silence is its own form of truth. The image lingers. Ingrid seated at a desk, pen in hand, the light dim, her daughter asleep in another room, the hum of Hollywood beyond the window. She writes quickly, folds the paper, seals the envelope. It is a small act, almost nothing, and yet it is everything. Outside, the neon glows, but in her heart there is only the vision of rubble-strewn Rome, of honesty, of a man she has not yet met. The letter leaves her hand, and with it, her life begins to drift toward another shore. And on that shore, the volcano smolders, waiting. The volcano smolders, waiting, its slopes barren and harsh, its smoke curling upward as if it too were restless. When Ingrid Bergman set foot on Stromboli, she was no longer only the Hollywood star carried on waves of adoration. She was a woman stepping into uncharted ground, guided by a director whose vision was as raw and unpredictable as the land itself. The meeting between Ingrid and Roberto Rossellini was not framed by glamour or staged by publicists, but marked by a startling sense of recognition. It was as though 2 lives, shaped by very different worlds, had been circling toward each other, and here, on this jagged island, they converged. Rossellini was not like the men of Hollywood. He carried no polish, no need to please. His face bore the lines of war's aftermath, his manner a mixture of charm and chaos. He spoke of cinema as if it were life itself, stripped of lies, a medium that could show the dignity of fishermen, the grief of widows, the resilience of those who lived among ruins. To Ingrid, weary of the artificial lights of studios, his words rang with the force of truth. She felt drawn to him, not with the slow unfolding of polite attraction, but with the immediacy of recognition, as if her own restlessness had found its echo. Filming Stromboli was unlike anything she had known. There were no sets, no rehearsed movements, no glamorous costumes. Instead, there was the sea, the wind, the volcanic ash beneath her feet, and villagers whose faces carried centuries of endurance. She, the celebrated actress, stood among them not as an untouchable star, but as one more figure in a landscape larger than herself. The camera did not flatter, it exposed, and in that exposure she found both terror and liberation. For the first time, she felt not that she was pretending to live a story, but that she was living it. The line between fiction and reality dissolved in smoke and salt air. But behind the camera, a different story was unfolding, one that no script could contain. Ingrid and Rossellini's connection deepened into intimacy, and intimacy became passion. They were drawn together with a force neither could resist, despite the knowledge of the chaos it would bring. She was still married, still the mother of a young daughter in America, still enshrined as the image of purity by millions of strangers. Yet here, on this volcanic island, those ties seemed to dissolve into ash. She had found something she could not find in Hollywood or in her marriage, a freedom that was both creative and personal, fierce and consuming. The island itself seemed to conspire in their affair. The volcano smoked as though restless. The sea roared with ceaseless energy. The air carried the scent of salt and sulfur. Life on Stromboli was hard, survival uncertain, and perhaps it was this very harshness that gave their union its urgency. They loved not in safety, but in danger, not in comfort, but in exposure. And in that, their passion reflected the art Rossellini sought to capture, the raw truth of life without polish or disguise. When word of their relationship reached beyond Italy, the response was explosive. America, still clinging to an image of Ingrid as saint and heroine, reacted with outrage. Politicians denounced her, newspapers condemned her, and ordinary citizens wrote letters filled with disappointment and scorn. She was branded immoral, a homewrecker, unfit to grace the screens that had once adored her. The force of condemnation was greater than she could have imagined, as though the very nation had taken her choices as a personal betrayal. And yet, on Stromboli, she did not turn back. With Rossellini, she discovered not only love, but a new way of living. They married after her divorce, and together they embarked on a tumultuous partnership, creating films that blurred the boundaries between art and life. Children were born, twins and a son, and her days filled with both domestic chaos and artistic pursuit. It was not an easy life. Rossellini was mercurial, their marriage stormy, but it was a life of authenticity, lived beyond the approval of others. Still, the price was heavy. She was separated from her daughter Pia for long stretches, and this absence weighed upon her heart. Though she rarely spoke of it publicly, the wound never fully healed. The scandal followed her, shaping how the world perceived her, closing doors in Hollywood and turning her into an exile. Yet she seemed to accept this, as if the cost was inseparable from the freedom she had sought. On screen, the films she made with Rossellini were often misunderstood, sometimes dismissed, but within them lay a profound honesty. In Stromboli, she was a woman trapped on an island, desperate for escape, mirroring her own sense of entrapment and longing. In Europa 51, she played a mother devastated by loss, her grief and spiritual search resonating with her own private struggles. These films did not dazzle like Hollywood's productions, but they carried a raw power that still lingers, like smoke drifting long after fire has burned. The image lingers, Ingrid standing on a cliff of Stromboli, the sea churning below, the volcano rumbling behind. Her hair is blown wild by the wind, her face stripped of makeup, her eyes filled with both fear and defiance. She is both actress and woman, both character and self, both saint and sinner. The world beyond may condemn her, but here, in the raw elements of earth and fire, she seems entirely herself. And so the volcano smolders still, not as a backdrop but as a mirror, reflecting the turbulence of a woman who refused to remain bound by the illusions others placed upon her. She had chosen passion, and with it she had chosen scandal. Yet within that scandal burned a truth she could not have lived without. From the smoke of Stromboli, we drift toward the storm that followed, when the voices of condemnation grew louder, when America turned its back upon her, when exile became her reality. But even then, even in exile, her light would not be extinguished. From the volcanic cliffs of Stromboli, the smoke rose high, but across the ocean another kind of smoke gathered, a storm of outrage and condemnation. Ingrid Bergman, who had once stood bathed in the soft mist of Casablanca's farewell, was now enveloped in a harsher fog, one woven not of cinema's dream but of public judgment. America, a land that had placed her upon a pedestal as its purest emblem of grace and dignity, now turned its face away from her with fury. The news of her love for Roberto Rossellini and of the child she carried reached the United States with the force of scandal. It was not simply whispered gossip in the studios or discreet paragraphs in magazines. It was thundered from headlines, debated in the halls of government, condemned from pulpits and podiums. A senator stood on the floor of Congress and declared that Ingrid Bergman had become a powerful influence for evil. To many, she was not merely a woman who had left her husband. She was a symbol of betrayal, a fallen idol who had exposed the hypocrisy of Hollywood's glittering images. The letters that poured into newspapers and studios were filled with venom. Mothers declared that they could no longer allow their daughters to see her films. Men who had once admired her spoke of her as though she had deceived them personally. Entire churches denounced her, and in some towns, theaters quietly removed her pictures from their screens. The swiftness of the turn was astonishing, as if the love the public had lavished upon her was equal in intensity to the anger it now directed against her. And yet, beneath this chorus of condemnation, there was also a quieter murmur. Those who did not speak so loudly, who perhaps understood that what she had done was not so strange, not so different from the desires that lived in many hearts. But these voices were drowned in the fury of the time, in a culture that demanded public figures embody virtues that private lives rarely sustain. For Ingrid, the exile was total. She could no longer return to Hollywood, no longer bask in the applause that had once seemed endless. The studios turned cold, contracts dissolved, doors closed. She lived in Italy now, not as a queen of cinema, but as a woman marked by scandal. Her reputation in America blackened beyond repair. The nation that had embraced her in the glow of Gaslight and Casablanca now cast her out into shadow. And yet, even as the world condemned her, she did not bow. With Rossellini, she continued to work, to live, to create. The films they made together were not adorned with glamour, but filled with rawness, with the ache of reality. Audiences did not flock to them. Critics often dismissed them. But for Ingrid, they carried a different kind of truth. She was no longer performing for applause. She was living art as survival, as confession, as expression of her own restless soul. It was not an easy life. Rossellini, brilliant but mercurial, brought as much turmoil as inspiration. Their marriage was stormy, filled with arguments and reconciliations, passion and despair. The children they bore filled their home with noise and warmth, but also with the exhaustion of constant demands. Ingrid, who had once been treated as untouchable, now found herself cooking, cleaning, raising children, filming on rough locations without luxury or comfort. To some, this might have seemed a fall from grace. To her, it was perhaps a strange form of liberation, though not without sorrow. Her daughter Pia remained in America with her father, and the separation left a wound she carried in silence. This was the deepest cost of all, greater than the condemnation of a nation, greater even than the loss of Hollywood. She rarely spoke of it, but those who knew her sensed the quiet pain behind her eyes, the knowledge that passion had demanded a sacrifice she could never fully mend. In Exile, her fame dimmed, but it did not vanish. In Europe, she remained admired, her performances still studied, her presence still commanding. Yet she was no longer the untouchable star, but a woman among contradictions. Adored by some, despised by others, always surrounded by the lingering smoke of scandal. What is scandal, then? Is it the breaking of a rule, or the refusal to hide it? Many in Hollywood lived lives of secret betrayals, of hidden affairs, of compromises veiled behind polished images. But Ingrid had lived openly, refusing to disguise her choices, refusing to craft a lie for the sake of public comfort. Perhaps it was this honesty, more than the act itself, that so enraged her critics. She had not only defied morality, she had defied the illusion that stars must live as saints. The image lingers. The newspapers spread across tables, headlines screaming of her disgrace, photographs of her no longer framed by admiration but by scandal. In smoky American bars, men shake their heads and mutter her name with disdain, while in Italy she walks barefoot through her home, a child in her arms, the scent of sea air drifting through open windows. The worlds are divided, one condemning, the other embracing, and she stands between them, exiled yet unbroken. From this storm of condemnation arises the next question. Can exile ever end? Can a star cast out so completely ever return to the embrace of the audience that once adored her? Or does the shadow of scandal stretch endlessly across a lifetime? For now, the answer was silence, a silence that settled upon her as surely as volcanic ash, heavy yet strangely enduring. The silence that settled upon her was like volcanic ash, heavy, inescapable, yet strangely protective, as though it shielded her from the noise of the world she had left behind. In America, her name was spoken with anger, her image tarnished beyond repair. But in Italy, she lived another kind of life, one not polished by studios or dictated by contracts, but shaped by the rough textures of love, art, and survival. It was here, in this exile, that Ingrid Bergman became at once diminished and renewed, a woman stripped of illusions, immersed in the fullness and the fractures of existence. Her marriage to Roberto Rossellini was unlike anything she had known before. Where her first husband, Peter Lindström, had given her stability, Rossellini gave her volatility. He was brilliant and erratic, tender one moment and harsh the next, his mind leaping from idea to idea, his ambitions always outpacing his means. Their household was filled with energy and turmoil, with arguments that flared like storms and reconciliations that arrived as suddenly as the sun after rain. Yet within this chaos, Ingrid discovered a kind of truth she had long hungered for. With Rossellini, nothing was safe, nothing was certain, and perhaps that very instability gave her the sense of being fully alive. Their films together reflected this same turbulence. Stromboli, their first, carried the bleak power of its volcanic setting, its story of entrapment and despair mirroring her own state of being. In Europa, 51, she played a mother shattered by the death of her child, a performance so raw and grief-stricken that it seemed less like acting than confession. Critics in Italy and France saw in it a bold exploration of spirituality and despair, but audiences in America, still unwilling to forgive her, dismissed it. Journey to Italy, filmed in 1954, followed a couple whose marriage decayed amid the ruins of Naples, and its quiet, fragmented style was so unconventional that it baffled many viewers at the time. Yet decades later, it would be hailed as one of the most important films in the history of cinema, a work that shaped the future of modern filmmaking. Ingrid, once polished into Hollywood perfection, now wandered through ruined streets, crumbling villas, and volcanic landscapes, her face unguarded, her voice stripped of melodrama. She was no longer the saintly Ilsa Lund or the luminous heroine of Hitchcock's thrillers, but a woman of flesh and shadow, her performances soaked with vulnerability, with longing, with the quiet weight of grief. She had traded the glow of applause for the intimacy of truth, and though the trade cost her fame and fortune, it gave her a depth that could not be measured by box office or awards. Yet the life she lived off-screen was no less demanding. With Rossellini, she bore 3 children, twin daughters Isabella and Isotta, and a son, Roberto. Their home was filled with laughter and chaos, the sound of children playing mingling with the endless debates about cinema, art, and politics. Ingrid, who had once been surrounded by servants and stylists, now found herself cooking meals, nursing babies, and struggling with the exhaustion of motherhood. She was still a star, but her stardom was dimmed by dishes and diapers, by sleepless nights and household quarrels. Perhaps it was here that she discovered another kind of strength, not the glamour of adoration, but the endurance of daily love. Still, the shadow of loss followed her. Her daughter Pia remained in America with her father, and Ingrid's separation from her was a wound that never closed. She wrote letters, visited when she could, but the distance was heavy, filled with guilt and longing. To some, this was proof of selfishness, of failure as a mother. To Ingrid, it was simply the cost of the path she had chosen, a cost she bore in silence, her grief hidden beneath the demands of work and family. In her performances of grieving mothers, of women lost in despair, one can sense the echo of her own pain, the truth that she rarely confessed aloud. Rossellini himself grew restless. His artistic ambitions were vast, his attention fickle, his relationships with others, both professional and personal, often blurred. Ingrid endured his affairs, his neglect, his sudden enthusiasms that left her adrift. Their love, which had begun with such fire, grew strained, weighed down by jealousy and disillusionment. Yet even in conflict they created, their films together bearing the imprint of their turbulent union. Art and life were inseparable, each feeding the other, each wounding the other. To the world beyond, Ingrid was still a scandalous figure, her name spoken with suspicion, her films rarely celebrated. But within Europe, among certain circles of artists and critics, she was admired for her courage, for her willingness to sacrifice fame for truth. She had abandoned Hollywood at its height, not for wealth or ease, but for the chance to live honestly, however painfully. Few stars of her stature had ever taken such a risk, and fewer still could endure its consequences with the dignity she carried. And so the silence of Exile was not entirely silence. It was filled with the cries of children, the arguments of lovers, the rhythms of daily life, the voice of a camera capturing faces in the rubble. It was not the silence of absence, but of transformation, of a woman who had stripped away the illusions of stardom and discovered the harsh, imperfect, unrelenting fullness of being. The image lingers. Ingrid in Europa, 51, walking through the streets of Rome, her face pale with grief, her eyes searching for meaning in a world that seems indifferent. She is both character and self, both actress and mother, both saint and exile. The performance is unforgettable not because it dazzles, but because it wounds, because it carries the ache of lived truth. From this life of exile arises the next turning point, the unraveling of her marriage to Rossellini, the collapse of their artistic and personal union, and the slow, hesitant path that would one day lead her back to the country that had cast her out. But for now, she remained in Italy, a woman both condemned and liberated, carrying her children in her arms and her truth in her gaze. As the ash of scandal slowly settled into the soil of her life. The ash of scandal settled into the soil of her life, but the ground beneath Ingrid Bergman did not remain still. What began with volcanic fire on Stromboli and the fervor of creation with Roberto Rossellini could not last unchanged. Passion, which had lifted her into exile, now began to erode, its flame burning not steadily but in restless gusts, leaving behind shadows and fatigue. Their marriage, once a union of kindred hunger, began to unravel, not suddenly, but with the slow inevitability of tides retreating from the shore. Rossellini was a man of brilliance and chaos, a director whose restless energy seldom allowed him to remain still. He pursued projects with feverish intensity, often abandoning them as quickly as they began, his ambitions outpacing his resources. Ingrid, who had once been drawn to his unpredictability, now found it wearying. Their home, already crowded with children and noise, became filled with quarrels, accusations, reconciliations, and fresh quarrels again. He sought new muses, new women, new distractions, and though she endured, her patience frayed. The films they created together reflected this turbulence. Journey to Italy revealed the quiet collapse of a marriage amid the ruins of Naples, and though it baffled audiences of its time, critics later hailed it as a masterpiece. Yet for Ingrid, the story felt uncomfortably close to her own life. The silences between husband and wife on screen echoed the silences that grew between herself and Rossellini at home. The arguments spoken by characters were often shadows of their own disputes, the longing glances captured by the camera drawn from their own unspoken griefs. Art and life were no longer merely intertwined. They were indistinguishable, each cutting into the other. Rossellini's restlessness deepened. He pursued affairs with the casual cruelty of one who assumed forgiveness would always follow. Ingrid, once willing to endure for the sake of passion, grew tired. The fire that had once made her willing to defy the world now seemed to consume her without renewal. She bore her children with devotion, raised them with tenderness, but the marriage itself became a burden, its storms offering little of the creative liberation that had first drawn her into its orbit. It is said that passion can burn too brightly to last, that what begins with fire often ends in ash. For Ingrid, the ash accumulated slowly, settling over the years until the weight of it could no longer be ignored. By the late 1950s, the marriage had collapsed in all but name. Their artistic partnership dissolved, their films together ended, and she was left to reckon with the ruins of what had once seemed the most necessary choice of her life. What then did she carry from those years? Perhaps it was the discovery that love and art, though both born of hunger, cannot always sustain each other. Perhaps it was the knowledge that to defy the world for passion is not the same as to find peace within it. Or perhaps it was simply the endurance learned long before in her childhood, when silence and absence had taught her to survive what could not be undone. The scandal that had cost her so dearly now seemed distant, replaced by the quieter sorrow of disillusionment. She was still, in the eyes of many, the fallen idol. But time had softened the edges of outrage. Younger stars had risen, new scandals had drawn attention, and her name no longer burned in headlines with the same fury. In the quiet that followed, she began to imagine a return, not only to her art, but to the world she had once been cast out from. For a time she remained in Europe, working on stage and in smaller films, seeking to rebuild not her image but her craft. The roles she chose reflected her own transformation, characters of complexity, of sorrow, of resilience. No longer the luminous ingenue, she now carried the weight of life in her gaze, and her performances deepened with it. Those who watched her on stage saw not a fallen star, but a woman reborn in truth. Yet even as she moved forward, the wound of separation from her daughter Pia remained. The years of distance could not be erased, and though reconciliation would come in time, the shadow of that loss lingered always. It was perhaps the most enduring price of her choices, one not paid in scandal but in silence, in the unbridgeable gap between mother and child. The image lingers, Ingrid seated in a quiet European room, the clamor of children in another part of the house, a script in her hand, her face marked not by glamour, but by lines of experience. Outside, the city hums with ordinary life, indifferent to the fact that once she had been the most adored woman in America, condemned by a senator, whispered about in every paper. Now she is simply a woman in exile, an actress reading lines, a mother listening to the distant voices of her children. But exile, even when chosen, does not last forever. The world shifts, outrage cools, and the same public that once condemned begins, slowly, to remember with longing what it has cast away. In time, the doors of Hollywood would open again, cautious at first, then wide, inviting her return. And when she stepped back across that threshold, she would do so not as the luminous ingenue of the 1940s, but as a woman tempered by fire, carrying both scandal and survival within her. For now, though, she remained amid the ashes of a broken marriage, her heart no longer aflame but steady, her gaze fixed not on what had been lost but on what still lay ahead. She remained amid the ashes of a broken marriage, steady now rather than aflame, her life quieter, but never free from restlessness. In the years that followed, Ingrid Bergman wandered through Europe in a state neither of triumph nor of collapse, but of searching. Hollywood had shut its doors, and the union with Rossellini had unraveled into memory. What remained was the wide in-between, a period of exile where she was neither the untouchable star she had once been, nor the renewed artist she would become. These years were filled with smaller roles, stage performances, and appearances in films that did not echo with the acclaim of her earlier triumphs. Yet within this wandering, there was also a deepening, a gathering of strength that would one day carry her back across the ocean. She worked in France, in Germany, in England, in the scattered corners of the continent, where cinema still thrived in pockets of resilience after the war. These productions did not always succeed, and critics were often divided, but Ingrid approached each with the same seriousness she had given to Casablanca or Notorious. She no longer sought applause alone. She sought expression, truth, and survival. To act was to breathe, and even in roles that audiences quickly forgot, she discovered fragments of herself. The stage also called to her in this period, offering the immediacy of live performance. In theaters across Europe, she appeared in works by Shakespeare, Ibsen, and Strindberg, returning to the roots of her craft. The applause was more intimate than the roar of cinema, the audiences smaller, the reviews more restrained, but the connection was no less real. She stood upon those wooden boards once again as she had in her youth in Stockholm, speaking words that had endured for centuries, and in that endurance she found solace. The theater asked for no image, no perfection, only presence. Still, the sense of exile weighed heavily. She was adrift between worlds, her name no longer spoken with the reverence it once commanded. In America, she remained marked by scandal, her return uncertain, her absence prolonged. In Europe, she was admired in fragments, never quite belonging to any one place. Home itself became an open question. Was it Sweden, where her childhood grief still lingered? Was it America, which had crowned and then cast her out? Was it Italy, where passion had both given and taken? Or was home nothing more than the stage, the screen, the camera that continued to know her even when nations did not? These years tested her. Financial struggles pressed upon her, for she no longer commanded the salaries of Hollywood. Rossellini provided little stability, and with their separation, she bore the weight of raising children while continuing to work. The glamour of her earlier life was gone. She lived not as a queen of cinema, but as a working actress, moving from project to project, country to country, never entirely settled. Yet perhaps in this wandering, she touched something truer, for she became less an icon and more a human being, known not for perfection but for resilience. Her daughter Pia, grown older now, remained across the ocean, and the distance between them was never fully bridged. Ingrid carried the guilt of separation quietly, rarely speaking of it, but her eyes betrayed the sorrow whenever the subject arose. With her younger children, she poured herself into motherhood, carrying them with her as she moved from place to place, balancing rehearsals with meals, performances with lullabies. The woman once untouchable on the screen was now touched constantly by small hands, interrupted by cries, her evenings filled not with champagne, but with the fatigue of ordinary life. And yet, even in this diminished state, there were moments of triumph. Audiences who saw her on stage often left moved, whispering of the power that still emanated from her presence. Critics who watched her in European films noted her depth, her willingness to expose fragility without disguise. She was no longer radiant in the polished sense of Hollywood, but luminous in another way, carrying the scars of experience, the lines of grief, the weight of years. Exile is not always a void. Sometimes it is a crucible, shaping what cannot be shaped in safety. For Ingrid, these years were a furnace in which she was stripped of illusions, forced to discover what art meant without the gilding of fame. She discovered that even without applause, even without the adoration of the masses, she could not stop acting. It was not a profession alone. It was her essence. To abandon it would have been to abandon breath itself. The world, too, began to change. The fury that had once condemned her softened with time. New scandals replaced the old. New stars rose and fell, and America's memory, though sharp in its judgment, was short in its endurance. Slowly, the heat of outrage cooled into a quieter curiosity. The question was whispered now not with venom, but with a tinge of longing. Whatever happened to Ingrid Bergman? The image lingers. She sits in a dim European dressing room, the mirror before her cracked at the edge, her makeup simple, her costume plain. Outside, an audience waits, small but expectant. She leans forward, studying her reflection, no longer the untouchable beauty of the 1940s, but a woman whose face carries lines of loss and resilience. She breathes deeply, then rises, ready to step once more into the light. For though the world may exile, it cannot silence. And from this quiet exile, there emerges the next chapter, the invitation, tentative at first, that would call her back across the Atlantic, back to the land that had once cast her out. A return not as the ingenue of old, but as a woman remade, carrying scandal and survival alike, ready to stand again before the gaze of the world. She leaned forward toward the cracked mirror in the dressing room, her face reflected in fragments, the lines of experience traced across her skin, her gaze steady despite the weariness in her eyes. It was a mirror unlike the polished ones of Hollywood's golden studios, yet in its fractured surface there was a kind of truth. She was no longer the ingenue of perfect symmetry, no longer the saintly figure preserved in luminous light, but a woman shaped by scandal, exile, motherhood, and loss. And it was from this broken reflection that a new path would slowly emerge, a path leading her back across the ocean to the country that had cast her out. Time, relentless in its movement, had softened the outrage. The America that once thundered with condemnation had turned its attention to other matters, other scandals, other idols to worship and discard. A decade had passed since Ingrid's name had been denounced in Congress, and in those years the nation itself had changed. The war had ended. New stars had risen. Cinema itself had begun to shift. The figure once seen as dangerous now seemed less threatening, perhaps even missed. Slowly, cautiously, doors began to open. Whispers turned into invitations, tentative at first, then stronger. Perhaps Ingrid Bergman might return. For Ingrid, the thought of stepping once more onto American soil carried both longing and fear. She had left not in disgrace alone, but in defiance, choosing passion and truth over image. To return meant to face not only critics, but ghosts, the memories of all that had been lost. Yet she also knew that her art demanded it. Europe had given her survival, but America still carried the stage where her legend had been born. To reclaim her craft fully, she would have to face the land of her exile. The opportunity came in the mid-1950s, when she was offered the role of Anastasia in a film about a woman who may or may not be the lost daughter of Russia's last czar. The story itself was steeped in ambiguity, in questions of identity and truth, and perhaps it was this very ambiguity that made it fitting for her. Ingrid, too, was a woman whose identity had been fractured. Saint in one decade, scandal in the next, exile in between. To play a woman reinventing herself, haunted by the question of who she truly was, seemed almost like fate. When she agreed to the role, anticipation buzzed across Hollywood. Would audiences accept her? Would they forgive her? Or would they turn away once more? The risk was immense for both the studio and for Ingrid herself. But when the film was released in 1956, the response was astonishing. Audiences, once so quick to condemn, now welcomed her with open arms. Critics praised her performance as extraordinary, filled with nuance, strength, and vulnerability. She was awarded the Academy Award for Best Actress, not only for her role, but for her survival, her endurance, her ability to transform scandal into art. It was a triumphant return, but not a return to the innocence of old. She could never again be the untouchable Ilsa of Casablanca or the luminous heroine of Hitchcock's thrillers. Instead, she was something deeper, a woman marked by life, carrying its contradictions openly, her artistry enriched by the very wounds that had once condemned her. The public, perhaps sensing their own capacity for contradiction, embraced her anew. Scandal faded into legend. Outrage softened into admiration. Yet even in this triumph, Ingrid did not surrender herself entirely to Hollywood. She returned to America, yes, but she did not stay bound to it. She continued to work across Europe, on stage and on screen, always restless, always searching. She had learned in exile that home was not a nation, but a calling, and that calling was art itself. Whether in New York, London, Paris, or Rome, she carried with her the same devotion, the same hunger to reveal truth. The image lingers. Ingrid standing at the Academy Awards, receiving the golden statue, the audience rising in ovation. Her face is radiant, but not with the innocence of youth. It is radiant with survival, with the dignity of a woman who has endured condemnation and returned unbroken. She smiles, and in her smile there is forgiveness, not only for herself, but for the world that had once cast her out. And from this moment of triumph arises the question, what does it mean to return? Is it to erase the past, to step back into what was lost? Or is it to carry the past forward, transformed into strength, into art? For Ingrid Bergman, the return was not a restoration of innocence, but a renewal of truth, the beginning of a final act in which her art would deepen even as her body grew frail. She stood upon the stage, the golden statue in her hand, the audience rising to its feet in a wave of applause that seemed to wash away a decade of silence. Ingrid Bergman, once cast into exile, now returned in triumph with Anastasia. Yet what glowed upon her face was not the naive radiance of a young star, but the quiet, weathered dignity of one who had walked through scandal, through loss, through the ruins of love, and emerged unbroken. The role itself had been one of uncertainty. A woman who may or may not be the lost daughter of Russia's fallen dynasty, a figure suspended between truth and illusion. How fitting that Ingrid, too, returned under the shadow of ambiguity, a woman no longer easily defined, no longer confined to saint or sinner, but something deeper. A survivor who carried her contradictions openly. The triumph of Anastasia restored her name to the public's embrace, yet it did not restore innocence. Hollywood welcomed her back, but she did not surrender herself to Hollywood's embrace as she once had. She had learned in exile that art did not belong to one place or one industry. She had lived among the ruins of Rome, walked through volcanic ash, carried children across continents, and stood on stages far from the glamour of Los Angeles. She had discovered that her home was not in adulation, but in expression, not in fame, but in the act of embodying truth. From this point forward, she belonged to no single country, no single tradition. She was a citizen of the stage, of the screen, of the shifting spaces where art flickers between light and shadow. The years that followed were filled with roles as varied as the seasons, some grand, some quiet, each carrying the mark of her maturity. She performed in European films, in American productions, on Broadway, and in London theaters. In Jean Renoir's Elena and Her Men, she revealed a playful charm that surprised those who thought her forever marked by solemnity. On stage, she appeared in Ibsen's Hedda Gabler and Strindberg's A Dream Play, returning to the Scandinavian roots of her craft, where words carried the weight of philosophy and silence, carried as much meaning as speech. Audiences marveled at her ability to inhabit these roles, not with the energy of youth, but with the gravity of experience. Her performances were no longer about perfection of beauty or polish of image. The camera still adored her, but now it adored her in a different way. It captured the lines etched into her face, the weariness in her eyes, the depth that only years of sorrow and endurance could carve. Where once she had been luminous with innocence, now she was luminous with truth, and in that transformation she became, for many, even more compelling. Off stage and screen, her life remained a tapestry of complexity. Her children grew, their voices filling the spaces once haunted by silence. Her daughter Pia, long estranged, re-entered her life in cautious steps, the years of distance never erased but slowly bridged by mutual understanding. Isabella, her younger daughter with Rossellini, began to find her own path, one that would lead her into acting as well, carrying forward the flame of a mother whose legacy could never be easily contained. Ingrid, once marked as a scandalous mother, now found herself surrounded again by her children, her love for them no longer obscured by exile but steady and enduring. In her later films of the 1960s and 1970s, she often played women marked by history, by sorrow, by survival. In The Visit, she portrayed a woman returning to a town that had once betrayed her, demanding justice with both cruelty and vulnerability. In Murder on the Orient Express, she appeared only briefly as a timid missionary, yet the quiet precision of her performance won her another Academy Award, this time for Best Supporting Actress. Each role seemed to mirror some fragment of her own life. The exiled returning, the betrayed enduring, the survivor speaking softly yet with unshakable force. The glamour of her early years had long faded, but something greater had replaced it, the weight of authenticity. She was no longer adored for embodying ideals, but revered for embodying truth, however painful, however imperfect. Her art had grown as she had grown, her face no longer a mask of purity, but a canvas of experience. The image lingers. Ingrid walking onto a stage in London, the audience hushed, the lights dim. She wears no elaborate costume, only the dignity of her presence. She speaks, and the words seem to come not only from the script, but from the depths of her own survival. The applause that follows is not the frantic adoration of youth, but the deep, sustained recognition of respect. From this season of varied work and renewed recognition arises the final act of her story, when her body, weakened by illness, could no longer sustain her without pain, and yet her spirit refused to yield. The years of endurance had prepared her for this last test, and even as her life drew toward its close, her art continued, blazing with a final, unforgettable light. She stood upon the stage in London, her presence alone enough to still the audience, and though the years had carved their lines upon her face, they had also deepened the gravity of her gaze. This was no retreat into memory, no clinging to the roles that had once made her luminous. Ingrid Bergman refused the comfort of nostalgia. Instead, she sought always the untried, the difficult, the roles that demanded more than beauty, more than grace, the roles that asked of her endurance, honesty, and the courage to stand exposed. The later years of her career were not a soft descent into retirement, but a restless continuation, a refusal to be confined. Some actors of her generation, weary of the industry's demands, withdrew into the shadows, allowing their reputations to rest in the glow of past triumphs. Ingrid could not. Acting was not her profession, it was her essence. To step away from it would have been to betray the very force that had carried her through scandal and exile, through grief and return. She worked not because she needed fame, but because she needed to live. She moved between film, television, and stage with the same hunger for expression. In European cinema, she found directors eager to work with her, drawn by her presence, her authenticity. In America, she returned to Broadway, her tall figure commanding the stage as easily as it had in her youth. She embraced new forms, even appearing in television productions when many of her peers dismissed the medium as beneath them. For her, no stage was too small, no format unworthy, so long as the work demanded truth. Her roles in these years were often of women marked by experience, figures of resilience, complexity, and sorrow. In The Visit, she embodied a woman hardened by betrayal, returning to her hometown to demand justice from those who had once wronged her. In A Walk in the Spring Rain, she portrayed a woman confronting the inevitability of aging and the temptations of passion. In each role, she refused to soften herself into sentimentality. Her characters were flawed, wounded, sometimes merciless, but always human. Audiences responded not with the infatuation of youth, but with respect, recognizing in her performances the truth of their own lives. She never allowed herself to become a monument. To remain in the safe glow of remembered triumphs would have been to calcify, to become something admired but no longer alive. Ingrid's spirit resisted such stasis. She was restless, always searching, always willing to risk failure if it meant touching a new dimension of truth. Even as illness began to shadow her life, she continued to work, refusing to let frailty dictate her art. Her personal life in these later years was steadier than in her tempestuous middle decades, though never without its complexities. Her children grew, each carving their own paths. Isabella, her daughter with Rossellini, followed her into acting, carrying with her both the burden and the blessing of her mother's legacy. Pia, once distanced, grew closer, the bond between them mended by time, though never without scars. Ingrid poured herself into these relationships with the same intensity she gave to her roles, aware of how much had been lost, determined to preserve what could still be held. She also cultivated deep friendships, many of them within the world of theater and film, bonds that sustained her as her body weakened. Those who knew her in these years spoke of her humor, her warmth, her refusal to be defeated by illness or age. She carried herself with the same tall dignity she had always possessed, unbowed, even when pain pressed heavily upon her. Yet the shadow of mortality drew nearer. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, a battle that would last nearly a decade. Surgeries, treatments, moments of reprieve, moments of despair, all became part of her daily reality. But she did not retreat. She continued to work through pain, concealing little, accepting that her body was changing, but insisting that her spirit remain unbroken. For her, illness was not an ending, but another role to play, another truth to embody, another reality to face with courage. The image lingers. Ingrid backstage, exhausted from rehearsal, her body aching but her eyes alive with the fire of performance. She sits in a chair, shoulders stooped with fatigue, then slowly rises, straightens her tall frame, and steps onto the stage. The audience sees only the presence, the voice, the truth. They do not see the scars, the pain, the nights of sleeplessness, and perhaps that is as she wished it, not to conceal but to transform, to turn suffering into art as she had always done. Her later work carried this transformation most clearly. Audiences who watched her in these years spoke of being moved not by glamour but by depth, not by perfection but by authenticity. She had become not only an actress but a witness, carrying on her face the evidence of a life fully lived, of choices boldly made, of losses endured. From this restlessness, from this refusal to fade, arises the final act of her story. For even as cancer pressed upon her, Ingrid Bergman would deliver one last performance, a portrayal of another woman who carried the burdens of leadership and the weight of mortality. It was to be her farewell to the world, filmed with fragility and strength in equal measure, a testament to the fire that had never left her. Backstage, she had straightened her body against pain, carrying her roles as though they were armor. But when the curtain fell and the applause faded, it was no longer the audience that sustained her, but the private threads of love and companionship that gathered around her life. Family and friendship became the quiet stage upon which Ingrid Bergman now played her most enduring part. Her children were at the center of this circle. Pia, the daughter from her first marriage, who had once grown up at a distance, began to move closer, the years of separation bridged by a growing understanding. Though the absence of her early years could never be undone, Pia recognized in her mother not only the actress admired by millions, but the woman who had struggled, erred, endured, and never ceased to love. Their conversations deepened, sometimes tender, sometimes difficult, but threaded with the bond of truth. With Isabella, Isotta, and Roberto, the children of Rossellini, she shared not only maternal devotion, but a companionship born of shared wanderings, of houses filled with argument and laughter, of travels from set to set. Each of them bore the mark of her restlessness, yet also the warmth of her care. Friends, too, formed a tapestry around her. Many were drawn from the world of theater and film, kindred spirits who understood the strange rhythm of lives spent in rehearsal rooms and studios. With them, she shared evenings of quiet conversation, glasses of wine, reflections on art and memory. Some spoke of her humor, quick and mischievous, which seemed at odds with her solemn image on screen. Others recalled her directness, her refusal to flatter, her insistence always on honesty, even when it stung. These friendships, scattered across cities and decades, became the hidden roots that steadied her, unseen by audiences, but vital to her strength. Illness shadowed these years, pressing upon her body with increasing insistence. The cancer that had been diagnosed would not relent, and though she submitted to operations and treatments, it returned again and again, reshaping her body, testing her endurance. Yet even in weakness, she refused to surrender the fullness of life. She worked when she could, traveled when she was able, and welcomed her loved ones with a warmth that concealed her pain. Those close to her spoke of her refusal to be pitied, of the way she carried illness not as a badge of suffering, but as another reality to be lived with dignity. Her home became a place of gathering, filled with the voices of children and grandchildren, with friends passing through, with the quiet rituals of meals, of books, of conversations by lamplight. She was no longer the woman whose every movement was charted in magazines, but one who lived in the ordinary intimacy of family. Yet even here the extraordinary shone through. Her children remembered the way she listened, fully and without distraction, the way she encouraged them to follow their own paths, never insisting they live in the shadow of her fame. She gave them freedom, as she had once demanded it for herself, even knowing that freedom is always accompanied by risk. The years brought reconciliation with some who had once judged her harshly. Critics who had condemned her during the scandal now wrote with admiration of her resilience. Colleagues who had distanced themselves now spoke with respect of her strength. The public, too, seemed to soften, no longer clinging to the rigid moral codes that had once demanded her exile. Time had given perspective, and what once was scandal now appeared as the choice of a woman unwilling to live a lie. The shadow did not disappear, but it no longer defined her. Still, it was in the private spaces, not the public ones, that her final years found their meaning. She found joy in her grandchildren, in their laughter, in the continuation of life beyond her own. She found solace in simple rituals, in evenings spent with music or books, in the company of those she loved most. And even as illness pressed harder, she found strength in the knowledge that her life had been fully lived, not without error, but without surrender. The image lingers. Ingrid sitting by a window, the light of late afternoon falling across her face, a grandchild upon her lap, her hand resting lightly upon the child's shoulder. Her hair is thin now, her body frail, but her eyes still carry the same steady fire they held when she first stood before a camera in her father's studio as a child. She looks outward, not backward, as if even in the twilight she is still searching for what lies beyond. And from this window-lit moment, the story moves toward its final chapter, when illness could no longer be held at bay. And yet her art, refusing silence, would blaze once more in a performance that astonished the world. The light of late afternoon that fell across her face at the window seemed gentle, but it was also the light of a body entering its final struggle. Illness, which had shadowed her for nearly a decade, pressed closer now. Breast cancer gnawing at her strength with a persistence that no operation or treatment could banish. And yet Ingrid Bergman refused to yield her spirit to despair. She endured the pain with a dignity that astonished those around her, transforming suffering not into silence, but into fuel for the art that still burned within her. She had always known how to carry contradiction, and in these years she carried the greatest contradiction of all, a body that faltered and a spirit that refused to stop. Even as the disease weakened her, she chose to work. Her last years were not spent in retreat, but in labor, in performance, in the act of giving herself once more to the world. Acting, for her, had never been mere profession. It was her lifeblood, the way she inhabited existence. To abandon it in illness would have been to abandon herself. And so she continued. She appeared on stage when her body allowed, in films when roles came, and at last, in a final blaze of effort, she undertook a performance that would be remembered as her farewell, the portrayal of Golda Meir, the formidable Israeli prime minister, in the television film A Woman Called Golda. The choice itself was remarkable. Here was Ingrid, frail and ill, embodying a woman of immense resilience and political strength, a leader whose presence seemed to tower above her frail frame. Filming was grueling, the demands heavy, yet she pressed forward, determined that her body's weakness not silence her voice. Those who watched her work in those months spoke of her extraordinary force of will. Between takes, she would collapse into exhaustion, her face pale, her body trembling. Yet when the cameras rolled, she transformed. Her voice carried authority, her eyes burned with intelligence and resolve, her figure radiated power. It was as if she poured all the remnants of her strength into the performance, emptying herself in order to leave behind one final act of truth. When the film was released in 1982, audiences were astonished. Critics praised her portrayal as magnificent, a crowning achievement that revealed not only the character of Golda Meir, but the indomitable spirit of Ingrid Bergman herself. For this role, she was awarded an Emmy, one of several she had received in her later career. The recognition was sweet, but sweeter still was the knowledge that even in illness, even in the twilight of her life, she had remained faithful to the art that had sustained her since childhood. To the end, she was an actress, not of image alone, but of truth. Illness did not only bring suffering, it also brought clarity, stripping life down to its essentials. Ingrid found herself drawn ever closer to her children, who surrounded her with care and love. Isabella, in particular, was by her side, witnessing the strength with which her mother bore pain, learning from her example that art and dignity are not undone by frailty. Pia, reconciled after years of distance, offered her presence, bridging the gap that once seemed unbridgeable. In these moments, family became not a shadow of what was lost, but a reality of what remained, a source of solace amid the storm of decline. Friends, too, gathered, offering companionship, laughter, and the warmth of presence. Even in her final months, Ingrid found joy in conversation, in small pleasures, in the taste of wine, in the glow of lamplight upon familiar rooms. She did not deny death's approach, but neither did she let it steal from her the simple richness of being alive. She accepted her fate with the same honesty with which she had lived, unafraid to acknowledge pain, unwilling to surrender to despair. The image lingers. Ingrid on the set of A Woman Called Golda. Her body weakened, wrapped in a shawl between scenes, her hands trembling slightly as she holds a cup of tea. Then the call comes. The camera's ready, and she rises, steadies herself, steps into the light. Her posture straightens, her voice strengthens, her gaze hardens into authority. The transformation is not the denial of illness, but the triumph of spirit over its weight. She speaks the lines, her eyes flashing with conviction, and for a moment, all forget the frailty of her body. They see only strength, only fire, only the woman who had refused to bow to the world's judgment, to scandal, to exile, and now refused to bow to death. And so her illness, which might have silenced her, became the backdrop against which her final performance blazed all the brighter. She had lived her life defying the roles others imposed upon her: saint, sinner, exile, icon, and now, even in dying, she shaped her own role, one of endurance, courage, and grace. From this blaze of final performance, the story turns toward its closing, the night of her passing, when the curtain fell at last, not upon a stage, but upon her life. And yet the memory of her presence refused to fade. From the blaze of that final performance, when her spirit shone against the frailty of her body, the story turns toward her last days. Ingrid Bergman had given all she could to the world of art, emptying herself into her roles until even pain seemed a part of the performance. After a woman called Golda, she had little strength left to offer, and yet she did not sink quietly into shadow. She lived her final months with the same mixture of dignity and fire that had carried her through the decades, balancing the intimacy of family with the quiet awareness that the curtain would soon fall. Her illness grew heavier, her body more fragile, and yet she faced it without disguise. Friends who visited her in these days spoke of her calm, her honesty, her refusal to hide the truth of her condition. She did not wish to be remembered as invincible, nor pitied as broken, but simply as a woman who had lived fully and now accepted the ending of that life. She continued to find joy in small things, in the laughter of her children, in the warmth of sunlight across a window, in the taste of food shared around a table. Even in pain, she sought presence, never turning away from the simple fact of being alive. Her children were with her, each carrying their own memories of her turbulent life. Pia, the daughter of her first marriage, offered tenderness that seemed to close the long distance that had once separated them. Isabella, Isoda, and Roberto, the children of Rossellini, surrounded her with devotion, their lives marked by the storms of her past, but steadied now by her enduring love. They saw in her illness not only decline, but also strength, the way she bore suffering without surrender. For them, she was not only the actress admired by the world, but the mother who had given them her presence, her warmth, her encouragement to live freely as she had once demanded for herself. Visitors came quietly, friends from the world of film and theater, offering companionship in hushed tones, remembering with her the long arc of her journey. Some recalled the early years in Sweden, when she was still a shy girl finding her voice. Others spoke of Hollywood's golden age, of the luminous Ilsa of Casablanca and the wounded wife of Gaslight. Still others remembered her defiance, the letter to Rossellini, the scandal, the exile. To each she listened with gentle humor, neither denying nor glorifying what had been. She seemed to see her life not as triumph or tragedy, but simply as a path walked with honesty, filled with choices she could not regret, however painful their cost. Her final public appearance was at the Emmy Awards in September of 1982, where she was honored for her role as Golda Meir. Too weak to attend in person, she appeared by recorded message, her voice clear, though her body already failing. She spoke with gratitude, her words steady, her presence still commanding. Audiences who saw her were moved not by glamour but by courage, sensing that this was not only an acceptance speech, but a farewell, On August 29, 1982, the day of her 67th birthday, Ingrid Bergman passed away in London. The timing itself seemed both cruel and fitting, a life beginning and ending on the same date, a circle closing with quiet symmetry. She died surrounded by family, the voices of her children near, the air filled not with applause but with love. The world awoke to the news with sorrow, and headlines that once had condemned her now honored her as one of the greatest actresses of her time. Tributes poured in, not only from Hollywood but from across the globe, each recalling her luminous presence, her extraordinary career, her defiance of convention, her indomitable strength. Her funeral was held in Sweden, the land of her birth, where she was laid to rest beside her parents. It was a return to the soil that had shaped her, the quiet northern land of long winters and lingering light. Crowds gathered not with the fury of past decades but with reverence, recognizing in her both the girl who had once stood before her father's camera and the woman who had crossed oceans, endured exile, and returned in triumph. The image lingers, the coffin carried through Stockholm, the bells tolling softly, the streets lined with mourners. Some carry flowers, others carry only silence, yet all carry the memory of a woman whose face had been etched into their lives through the flicker of film. Above, the northern sky is pale and vast, the same sky beneath which she had been born, the same sky that had witnessed her childhood losses, her youthful rehearsals before the mirror, her longings that had carried her far away. Her death did not end her presence. Films continued to be watched, her roles studied, her life debated. For some, she remained the saintly Ilsa, for others the scandalous Exile, for still others the survivor who refused to be broken. Perhaps the truth lies not in any single image, but in the entirety of them, in the contradictions she carried openly, refusing to live as anyone's perfect idol. And so, from her final blaze of performance to the silence of her passing, her story moves into memory. But memory does not fade. It lingers like the glow of a lamp in a darkened room, like the smoke of a volcano against the sky, like the mist of an airport farewell. Ingrid Bergman, the star who defied scandal, the woman who risked all for love and art, remains not only in film reels and photographs, but in the questions she left behind. What is the cost of freedom? What is the weight of passion? What does it mean to live without regret? From these questions, the story turns toward its final part, not a conclusion but a reflection, a meditation on the brilliance and defiance of a woman who lived under the shadow of scandal, yet refused to be broken by it. The bells of Stockholm still echo in the memory, their tones soft and steady as her coffin was borne through the streets, the northern sky pale above, the air filled with silence rather than applause. It was here, in the land where her life had begun, that Ingrid Bergman was laid to rest, her circle closed, her journey complete. Yet though her body returned to the soil of her childhood, her presence did not vanish. She lingered in the flicker of film reels, in the photographs left behind, in the recollections of those who had walked beside her, and in the imaginations of countless strangers who had once sat in darkened theaters and watched her face lit by a trembling beam of light. What remains of a life when its final day has passed? For Ingrid, it was not only the roles, though they endure, Ilsa in Casablanca, Alicia in Notorious, Paula in Gaslight, Anna in Anastasia, Golda in her final blaze of strength. These characters continue to live each time they are seen, carrying fragments of her truth. But more than roles, what remains is the example of her defiance, her refusal to live as others demanded, her willingness to embrace contradiction rather than conformity. She had been saint and scandal, exile and icon, mother and wanderer, artist and survivor. She was never one thing alone, and it was this refusal to be simplified that gave her life its enduring mystery. In her choices, we find questions rather than answers. Was she courageous or selfish in leaving her husband and child for Rossellini? Was she liberated or reckless in defying America's judgment? Was her exile punishment or salvation? The answers shift depending on the gaze, but perhaps what matters is not resolution, but the recognition that human lives are rarely neat, rarely simple, rarely free from contradiction. Ingrid Bergman embodied this complexity not only on screen but in her very being, and in that, she offered a truth far deeper than the flawless images that Hollywood once demanded. Her life invites reflection on the nature of freedom. She longed for authenticity, for roles that revealed life rather than disguising it, for love that consumed rather than merely comforted. Yet freedom carried cost. Exile, condemnation, separation from her child, the collapse of passion into disillusionment. And still, she never retreated from that cost. She bore it with dignity, and when the chance to return came, she did so not as a repentant figure seeking absolution, but as a woman who carried her past openly, unashamed of having lived as she chose. It is tempting to imagine her story as a tragedy, marked by scandal and loss, but perhaps it is better seen as a testament. For in every phase, childhood silence, Hollywood adoration, Italian exile, triumphant return, final endurance, she remained true to her own path. She did not always find happiness, but she found truth, and perhaps that is the greater gift. The image lingers. A young girl in Stockholm, her parents gone, standing before a mirror and rehearsing words to an audience of silence. The same girl becomes a woman upon the Hollywood stage, radiant beneath lights, adored by millions. The same woman walks barefoot on volcanic ash in Stromboli, condemned by a world that once praised her. The same woman stands again before an audience, older now, her face lined, her presence deeper, receiving an Oscar, an Emmy, applause that is no longer innocent but profound. And at last, the same woman sits by a window in her final months, frail in body yet steady in gaze, holding her grandchild, looking outward toward a horizon no one else can see. Her story, then, is not one of rise and fall, but of light that shifts, dims, flares, and finally settles into memory. A light that was never extinguished, a light that continues to glow wherever her films are watched, wherever her name is spoken, wherever someone wonders at the mystery of a woman who dared to live by her own truth. And so we leave her, not in silence, but in reflection. The bells of Stockholm have ceased their tolling. The coffin has long been laid to rest, yet her presence remains. Like the scent of smoke after fire, like the echo of a song long after its last note, like the lingering image of a face upon the screen, even when the projector falls quiet. Ingrid Bergman lived under the shadow of scandal, yet she refused to be broken. She chose love, passion, and art, and in so choosing, she gave to the world not an image of perfection, but a testament of humanity. And perhaps that is why, even now, as you listen in the quiet of your own place, her story feels alive. It asks of you not judgment but contemplation, not certainty but wonder. What does it mean to live truly? What is the cost of passion? Can scandal destroy a soul, or does it only reveal its strength? These questions drift like mist, unresolved, inviting each of us to find our own answers. The image fades at last. The northern sky, pale and endless, the sound of distant bells, and the memory of a woman whose gaze once held the world.